definitive formulation. He's echoing statements made by various other people, including Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, both of whom have harped on the same thing. We can imagine catastrophe. Right? The way Žižek put it, I think, was it's very easy for us to imagine total catastrophe, total collapse of human life, total collapse of society. I mean, apocalyptic fantasies haunt us totally, and we can see this in films and other popular culture presentations. What we don't seem to be able to imagine is, Žižek says, an arrangement would just make things slightly more humane than the actual existing capitalism is. In other words, one word, say, a world where people, we're not a perfect world, but a world where people didn't starve, where people had jobs, and where there wasn't the kind of grotesque misdistribution of income that we have in America and the world today. And this has to do, I mean, there's a kind of, politically, there's a demoralization of the left which has been going on for, I wouldn't say since 1989, even since 1979. The election of Thatcher in 79 and then Reagan in 80 is already a point of this. As Fisher puts it, we're haunted by the widespread sense not only that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, but that it's now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Again, there's a kind of, and this is something, again, other people like Žižek and Jameson have talked about, there's a kind of blockage of imagination. We can't imagine circumstances being different. Fisher, it seems that the future harbors only reiteration, repermutation. Fisher starts the book with a kind of brilliant reading of sort of film, I'm blanking now, Children of Men, the film Children of Men, which sort of presents a world in which children stop being born, and they're basically, everybody's getting older and there are younger people, and sees this as a kind of allegory of the fact that we can't imagine a future or anything different. Margaret Thatcher famously said in the early 80s, there is no alternative. So anything bad about neoliberal hegemony, anything bad about ruthless, struggle to the death capitalism is just, well, it may not be that good, but there's no alternative to it. There's no other imaginable way. This was expressed in positive terms by somebody like Francis Fukuyama, who wrote rhapsodically after 1989 that the yelling end of history had come with the fall of communism, and that now we were entering into a point. He's recently revised his opinion. He's much more pessimistic now, but again, his pessimism about both biotechnology and ethnic nationalism reflects a kind of apocalyptic idea that we can't, instead of this being the best of all possible worlds, however not good it was, now it could get even worse. So again, I take this blockage of an ability to imagine a different future to be the key situation which we're dealing with. And again, part of my idea when I wrote about contemporary Western films, I mean, part of my point is that it seems to me these films are very much grappling with this impossibility. They're banging their heads against this kind of closure and lighting up the full extent of the prison house in which we actually do live. But there's no imaginational alternatives. I want to look at Eastern European films because I have a sense that the way they look backwards to the past, they also are looking forwards to a possible future which can be imagined from their position better than it can from ours. And again, I realize that their and ours shouldn't be this kind of radical disjunction. I'm exaggerating it when I talk about it in this way, but I'm just trying to register the shift of perspective which I get from these films. On the positive side, I'm drawing a little bit on I was at a conference in London a couple years ago called about the idea of communism, and which was organized by Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek and other people like Tony Negri and Michael Hart and other recent theorists attending. And what I don't much like a lot of what Badiou says, but Badiou puts forward what he calls the communist hypothesis as the kind of idea that we have to, in effect, imagine an alternative to the present system, a better alternative system, as a kind of Kantian regulatory idea, as something which we can't figure out a way to actually institute, but which has to guide our practice and which we have to be faithful to in a certain way if we want things to be different, if we don't want to accept that this is the only way it can be and that there is no alternative. The flaw for me, or the obnoxious part for me of Badiou is that although this would be confused by saying that Badiou is a Maoist, but he's not a Marxist. He talks about politics and talks about how he talks about how, seizing of power and all these kind of things. He doesn't really say anything about economic systems. And it seems to me to be a misdirection. And here I find myself, maybe somewhat to my surprise, much more in alignment with Frederick Jameson. I remember when I was in graduate school in the late 1970s, and then, I mean, basically, I had Jameson was at Yale for a few years when I was a graduate student there. I had great problems with Jameson's ideas. There were several sticking points. One was the idea of utopianism, and at that time, I think I bought into a kind of Nietzschean critique that utopia means a plan, something where everything's planned, everything's supposed to be perfect. If it's perfect, then nothing happens, it's completely sterile, it's completely changeless, and what could be more awful than utopia? I don't really feel that way anymore for several reasons. One reason is because of the way that argument has itself become a kind of alibi for the neoliberal global capitalist order. And again, this Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative. To suggest an alternative that things don't have to be this way, to suggest we don't have to have the grotesque inequalities and us being at the merciless sway of the supposed, the market, whatever that means. You're automatically now for being utopia, for things can be perfect. So, I mean, there's been identification of perfection with anything different from what we have, aside from apocalyptic destruction, and dismissal of the idea of a static perfection as being therefore what we have now is all the best we can have. And so I've begun to think that the idea of utopianism, as expressed by Jameson, Ernst Bloch, and others, seems more useful to me now than it was in 30, 40 years ago. I also think Jameson himself registers this difficulty of imagining things otherwise by saying, the first two quotes I have here, the radical break is a cession of utopia for political possibilities as well as from reality itself accurately reflects our current ideological state of mind. So for Jameson, utopianism is a way to deal with the fact that the left is unable to imagine things better or different. This failure of imaginative possibility is part of precisely what utopianism reflects. Utopia is a meditation on the impossible, he says, on the unrealizable in its own right. So again, the objective condition is that we're forbidden or we're unable to imagine difference, and yet I say a Kantian ethical imperative is that we must imagine something different, which is my version of what you call the communist hypothesis. And the question of how is it possible to do this without seeming silly and naive and engaging in hippie-ish fantasies or something like that is precisely the problem which I see these films addressing. The other quote from Jameson is, I think, a significant counterweight to the kind of Badiou's and Zizek's sort of fantasies. I mean, Badiou and Zizek sort of really get off on the idea that, I mean, they seem to be more interested in having a bloody revolution which they kill a lot of people. It seems to be more appealing to them than the fact that perhaps a better society could be attained afterwards. And I really have no investment in those fantasies of theirs, though I do have the hope that a different and better society could be established. So, I mean, Jameson says, there can never be a satisfactory political solutions or systems, which is a sad wisdom I tend to agree with. But, he says, there can be better economic ones. And that's something which I'd like to think is imaginable, too. The films I talk about here don't directly deal with economic reorganization. But, again, I said they're affected by the fact that they deal with the difference of these socioeconomic systems and what feelings they create, what traps they bring us in, how we are interpolated by them, and how we feel about them. Itself brings me away to not look for a perfect utopian, in the old-fashioned bad sense, political solution, but to look at possibilities of difference. Okay, now I see. I'm not going to have enough time to talk about all three films, so I have clips. I'm not sure how many of the clips I'll play because I really won't have. I mean, I could play the clips and then the hour will be over, and that'll be all I've done. So I'll see what I can do. But anyway, I have the slides. I have stills at least from some of the films, and I'll try to describe the three films in the order I've mentioned. Okay. The first film is called Taxidermia by Georgi Palfi, and this is a film which, again, has grotesque body parts. It's basically a film which is divided into three parts. They're like three narratives, which represent the histories of three generations of men in Hungary over the course of the last 75 years. So during World War II, the first part takes place during World War II, when Hungary was ruled by a fascist government, a fascist nationalist government which collaborated with the Nazis. The second part deals with the later 20th century when Hungary had a communist government. The third part deals